Hi, everyone. I'm Ro Reddick from the NYU Production Lab. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. There's quite a few of you. We're really excited about that. I am just popping my head in really quickly to just take a minute to acknowledge everything that's been going on, and that's been top of mind for myself, and I'm sure all of you and the rest of the NYU community. And that is the recent tragedies and injustices we've been witnessing in relation to police brutality. It's weighing heavy on our hearts and minds. And so it was really important for us to just take a second to say unequivocally to our Black students and alumni, we stand with you. Black Lives Matter. The NYU Production Lab is in solidarity with the Black community, and we are firmly standing against racism and injustice. Our hearts are broken, but we have come together tonight as a community, which is our strength, to manage another challenge that has presented itself this year, and that's how do we launch and sustain creative careers in the context of COVID. And so a lot of people have come together from across the university to make this event possible. So we're gonna just take a second to acknowledge our partners. The NYU Production Lab is partnered with NYU LA, the Wasserman Center for Career Development, and the Tisch Office of Career Development. And so we wanna say a special thank you to each of our partners. And we also wanna let you know that tonight's event is being recorded and that it will be a resource that is available to you along with another document that we're preparing full of resources and links to support you this summer. So we will send that out to all attendees via email. So without further ado, I would love to turn it over to our moderator for tonight, Rebecca Agby Davies, who is incredible. She is an accomplished entertainment executive whose expertise really spans, well, she's done it all. So it spans Emmy award-winning TV series, studio acquisitions, program planning, distribution partnerships, brand marketing, data science, and product management. She is a Tisch alumna, and she is currently the executive director of the distribution sales team at Sony Pictures Entertainment. Rebecca, please, welcome.
Oh, mute. Thank you so much, Ro. Thank you for the warm introduction. Hello, everyone. And as Ro mentioned, my name is Rebecca Agby Davies. I'm an alum from Tisch School of the Arts, and I want to welcome you to the business snapshots of the current media and entertainment landscape from the professionals who run it. So, to echo Ro, the past few weeks and the 400 years that we've been occupying this country and the past 6 days and the past 3 months have been very traumatic. And in spite of what is going on and the injustice and the oppression and marginalization that is ever present, I'm so honored to be here tonight so we can talk about these other issues that we're facing, and I'm happy to be your host. And we have some incredible experts who want to share their talents and their advice with you. And I really hope that this will be fun and informative and inspiring, and that it still won't take away from or ignore what is actually happening in our country. NYU has been hosting many virtual events since the pandemic began, and this one is the kickoff of a summer series for the broader NYU community that was started by Nina Sadowski and her amazing team at NYU LA, and supported by the partner groups that Ro mentioned. And our goal today is really to provide you, students and alumni, with insights into how the pandemic is affecting the arts, theater, film, television, more. And so these 5 experts are here to give TEDTalk-style presentations on a particular area and to give you a snapshot of concerns that are top of mind for us, the priorities and the challenges as we move forward. Just a reminder, this event is here for you. We're all here gathered for you. So please submit your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, not in the chat. The chat is for technical issues or technical questions. We have questions for our panelists. Please put them into the Q&A. But also please keep in mind we have quite heavy attendance today, so we might not be able to get to everyone's questions. We have limited time with the speakers, so please don't be offended if we don't get to you. To your question in particular. And so before we get started with our first speaker, who is amazing, as I mentioned, I'm Rebecca. I will be your moderator. And I just wanted to touch on the fact that the pandemic has created just complete social and economic crisis. And there's so much stress and uncertainty right now. And that is why NYU has come together, as Rose said, as a community. And we understand, particularly if you have just graduated or if you're a rising senior or you're a junior just trying to get an internship, that this is a really, really scary and stressful time. And what I would love to say to you and hope you take away is that when we have chosen a career in the arts or entertainment, it already feels uncertain, right? Because it's like, it's this non-traditional thing. And what I want to encourage you all to think about is the fact that this uncertainty can also be a point of strength and resilience. And it's an opportunity for us because we already know how to adapt and how to be flexible. We already have had to be like really resourceful to survive. As Ro mentioned, I've done so many things in my career. I've had to pivot in all kinds of ways to survive in this business, from being an animation producer and a ghostwriter for children's books and a mobile game developer. And I'm very grateful for many of the skills that I honed as an undergraduate production student at NYU. It taught me, among many things, how to collaborate with all different kinds of people and personalities to make a project come together on a deadline or a timeline, and I know how to organize anything. And so I think if we can acknowledge that these art skills that we've acquired are also life skills that will help us survive, then I think we can also acknowledge that these are the same skills that are appropriate for surviving both domestic and global crises. So I feel incredibly fortunate right now to have a job. My current job is a distribution executive, and I'm very happy that's my job to sell movies and TV shows so that you can watch them. And maybe it gives you a little bit of a break or escape from a stressful situation that you're in. I'm not someone who's gonna be super helpful in a hospital or a toilet paper factory or whatever, but I'm very good at figuring out strategy for how to get people to watch content and engage with it. And I hope that that's something in this time that gives people a sense of relief. So I think what you'll hear today from our presenters is that the entire entertainment business was already changing, right? And this pandemic is going to be an accelerant and will move us rapidly into the future. We're all having to think about how to adapt and be flexible and resourceful just like you are. And I think that's going to make some amazing opportunities because it's going to change a lot of the archaic structures and rules and things that have been in place for a long time. So that's my spiel. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first esteemed guest, Caitlin Robinson, who is an immersive media producer currently at XR creative company Scatter. Caitlin?
Here I am. I wasn't sure if I was doing the job of unmuting myself. Clearly I was.
Welcome, welcome. Take it away, please.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to both you, Rebecca and Ro, for kicking us off. It's obviously an honor to be among such esteemed guests and to get to connect to the NYU community who I hold very dear, who I feel like really kicked me off in my own career. So a little bit about me. I work at a company called Scatter. We are a creative company making immersive stories and the tools to create volumetric films. We won an Emmy for a project called 0 Days VR in 2019. I wanted to chat to you today about sort of how you would enter the XR industry, which I will a little bit. But I feel like at this time, it also feels really important to talk about why to enter the creative industries, whether that's XR or anything else at all. And this week in particular, I'm feeling the kind of urgency around capturing our stories, around sharing them and finding our humanity. So I guess I just want to open up by encouraging everybody to be bold and to stake your claim in the field where you feel like you can have an impact. So we don't have a lot of time today, and I'm talking about the very nebulous category of XR. I'm not going to go into depth about what it is. Google is your friend. But it's a broad category that's encompassing virtual and augmented reality. Its edges overlap with film and gaming and other industries. And generally, I'm talking about bringing content into the physical world around you or being immersed in another world. And so typically that would happen through some kind of technological intermediary, like a virtual reality headset, which I have one right here, or an AR app on your smartphone, and there are other formats too. So there's a lot of excitement and investment in XR because it's likely the future of computing, the next big shift in human life. But my interest is primarily in storytelling through this new medium. And it is, I think, the newest kind of category that's on the list today of things people are going to be talking to you about. And what I find really extraordinary is that artists are getting to really build the technology and the vernacular of it alongside the programmers and the investors that are kind of creating what this is. So I want to give you a couple of examples of virtual reality documentaries that I worked on over the past year. So one of them is called Lagos at Large, and it's a poetic view of a Nigerian-born woman who was raised in the US, but then she returns to Lagos, the capital of Nigeria, and finds a very stratified, gentrified place, and she kind of has to vie for where her identity fits within that. And so that was one of Forbes' top 50 experiences, XR experiences of 2019. Another project that I premiered at Sundance at the beginning of this year is called Asibuya, which is kind of centered around the topic of illegal housing occupation as an act of resistance by artists in Johannesburg, South Africa. And so it's looking at the issue of land reform in South Africa and whether or not social justice can exist at all in a capitalist system. And so I wanted to kind of just mention those documentaries and the kind of attention that they've received, just to kind of, I guess, demonstrate that this medium is new, and these type of issues might typically be kind of sideswept or, kind of not receive a lot of attention because they're not like mainstream issues, but there are really important issues around people and identity and the stories that we tell. And because they're kind of have been, showcased within this medium, they've been able to kind of take their rightful place, in a global platform, and kind of have legitimacy and credibility alongside, other types of stories. I think it's really just something that I really appreciate about working in this space, is that the rules are unwritten and the barriers to entry are somewhat lower, and we're all getting to define what the medium is, and hopefully there's some progressive voices at the forefront that get to determine what stories get told. So I want to, I guess, shift focus a little bit and talk to you a little bit about what does it mean to enter the XR industry, I guess, in light of COVID-19, and just talk a bit about what the impact has been that we've seen. So the bad news is, it's a very new industry and it was already on shaky footing. The sort of momentum around initial bullish investment in VR has sort of subsided over the past couple of years. And so in terms of narrative content, you're seeing kind of back-end revenues are still well below what costs to produce things. Revenues typically coming from licensing to distributors who would sell to location-based entertainment places and festivals, things like museums and galleries, or direct to consumers via platforms like Steam and the Oculus Store. And so a lot of those are jeopardized by the pandemic. It's harder to get financing now, and obviously physical production is very much TBD in a way to figure out how to be safe in a pandemic and a production context. But on the other hand, there is some good news. So the VR marketplace is bigger than ever. There have been more headsets, way more headsets sold recently than ever. This past couple of months, a particular type of headset, the Oculus Quest, has been consistently sold out and restocked and sold out since March. It's actually been the Oculus is owned by Facebook, and it's been the largest driver of revenue growth for Facebook outside of their ads in this period. And so apart from more people owning the means to watch this type of content, there's also just a higher use of platforms. People have more free time and also more of a desire for a sense of physical escapism, which virtual reality in particular is offering. And so we're seeing that not only have the hardware sales increased, but a kind of milestone that's been reached over the past a week or two ago was the Oculus Quest content. So that's actual experiences that are sold, the pieces of content that people have paid to watch, just surpassed $100 million in sales. So I mean, there might not be huge numbers in terms of other entertainment industries, but when you consider that it's only been 1 year that figure has been raised, it's pretty extraordinary. So I guess another just impact of the pandemic to mention is that, you know, people have been forced to work offsite, and this has kind of increased our tolerance for interfacing remotely, but also emphasized instances where co-present interaction is essential. And virtual worlds are kind of offering a path forward there. So is this just a little niche? Yeah, it is pretty small for now, but I think it's here to stay. So I want to give you a snapshot of a few things that I'm really excited about at the present moment, that I don't know, maybe you're excited about too. Just a few buzzwords, I guess, that are going on right now. The metaverse, live events, virtual production, and virtual beings. And I'll just whiz through a little bit about what each of those mean to give you a bit of a taste. So the metaverse, the idea is that it's kind of the digitalization of the human experience. You can think of it as a planet, but it's non-physical. It is spatial, it's temporal, and it's social. So you can argue that social platforms like your Facebooks are the start of this, but the metaverse adds a spatial dimension that's persistent. So you can actually navigate through worlds and interact with other people. There's going to be an economy incorporated, and then content can exist within different formats inside these virtual environments. And there'll probably be many different metaverses. Different corporations will create them. And an example of a first mover here is Mozilla Hubs. Live events are something that you know, our phone's been ringing off the hook about. People trying to figure out what does it mean to have a live event if you can't be together in person now. Is there a way to have the kind of digital spatial version of that at the same time in a virtual space? So something really interesting that happened recently is a concert in a platform called Fortnite. So Fortnite is essentially a multiplayer online video game. But recently, Travis Scott, the musician, hosted or performed a virtual concert, a 10-minute virtual concert, which was basically the Fortnite's largest event ever, and had a couple of replays over 3 days. And in total, it was nearly 30 million unique viewers who watched this piece of content. And so now you're seeing Sony Music place a lot of job ads for the type of roles that you typically be seeing for kind of VR type spaces, you know, engineers and developers who can kind of create these worlds. And interestingly, the trailer for Christopher Nolan's upcoming summer film, Tenet, was also premiered in Fortnite. And so I guess there's a lot of interesting opportunities to consider around building these kind of virtual spaces. Who are the architects of this digital world, and who gets to decide what that space is that these pieces of kind of traditional content that move to these spaces, what that looks like. Virtual production has been a big buzzword even before COVID, but is increasingly important now. And so when I'm talking about virtual production, I'm talking about using digital augmentation on set to kind of collapse the gap between production and visual effects and post-production. And so there's some super interesting case studies to explore online for movies like The Mandalorian and The Lion King. There is kind of an engine called Unreal, which is also the driver behind the game Fortnite. And they've just released an update, or are releasing an update, which is kind of looking to be a game changer. And that's sort of driving a lot of what can be possible in kind of real-time effects in virtual production. And another, I guess, interesting company worth mentioning is Atlas V, who've kind of been described as the A24 of virtual reality. They recently acquired an animation studio and have plans to kind of ramp up virtual production capacity. So there's this really interesting kind of collapsing of like what building digital virtual worlds look like and how that kind of can relate to physical production that we may be more familiar with. The last thing on my hit list that I'm going to talk about is virtual beings. So here I'm talking about artificial kind of beings that are created that maybe have no person attached behind them. An interesting example is the digital influencer Little Michaela. So she's a Instagram character who sort of presents herself as a real person, even though she is completely computer generated. She just signed to CAA, just like a real talent person could. And on the flip side of that, we have this question of real people kind of trying to represent themselves in a digital space. Personal avatars are very hard in virtual reality today. No one's really cracked this yet. The company that I work for, Scatter, we build software that makes volumetric video possible. So you can film people with depth too. It kind of opens up some really important conversations that we need to have around the ownership of digital representation. It's kind of blurry lines around personhood, and then the politics of representing physical bodies and social identities when we are moving between a physical world where we still haven't figured that out, and now transporting that to the digital spaces. What are we taking with us? What's the baggage that we have? And so that's it. That's my quick hit list and intro to what's going on in the world of XR. I want to end it off with a little bit of advice. I mean, we're all learning from each other still, and I'm certainly by no means an expert. But for me, I think what's been helpful for my producing work in general, I always endeavor to, network, go to events and meet people. I think we need to kind of think collectively about how we can facilitate that now. It's, I think, really important to connect to other people, but also to connect people to each other and be that person who can play that interstitial role. I like to think of how I can be helpful rather than how people can serve me. And in general, just say yes to as many things as possible, maybe to my detriment. And then speaking for the kind of XR space in particular, I really encourage people to be experimental, just make stuff. Don't wait for resources, don't wait for permission, make small stuff, make what you can, make it now, because you'll learn as you're making it, and possibly it'll be good, who knows. And my own entry into XR was kind of collaborating with other creative technologists. So my last piece of advice is to play with code, because it's creative. It really is. Yeah, it's, I guess, all from me.
Oh, hey, Caitlin, thank you so much. It's not all from you. We have some questions for you if you have a few minutes more to stay with us.
Sure.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. So I think some really great questions coming through the Q&A, so thank you everyone. But an interesting question, I know because you've worked all over the world, where do you think is a great place to work if you're interested in the XR space? Is it like LA, New York, Vancouver, Hong Kong? Like what are some of you mentioned some companies, like what are some options in terms of location for leveraging that, even when we're all trapped inside?
Yeah, it's a great question at a time when it feels like it doesn't matter where you work. We're all indoors.
Yeah, and does it matter?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I can't answer that, because I think we're going to see companies change their policies and figure things out and reshift. I would say that maybe my answer a couple of months ago would have been that it sort of depends where you see yourself in this industry and what's the kind of role that you want to have. I think New York is really interesting because if there's this kind of indie creative technology scene where you have a lot of like folks collaborating with each other and kind of getting projects on the ground in the same way that kind of maybe the indie film industry in the 90s operated, where if you can find a camera, you can make a movie. And so it feels like that kind of spirit is pretty pervasive in the XR space in New York in particular. Whereas LA, there's a lot of interesting work going on that's like connected to Hollywood, and you're seeing larger studios put like larger budgets into a lot of exciting VR projects. It's a lot of brand work going on everywhere, or like if people figuring out, like, is augmented reality a different way to talk to consumers, and if that's kind of storytelling you want to do. It kind of happens almost in any major city. Yeah, if you kind of are more on the like technical side and want to be deep in the weeds of coding and visual effects, Vancouver's great. Work at ILM. So I think there's really a lot of different options. I will say that ultimately it's a small enough industry that it is very globally connected, and it does feel like you can kind of get to know everybody pretty quickly.
It's a pretty small world, yeah. Okay, fantastic, thank you. And then how important, I bring this up to you specifically because you have both an MFA and an MBA. How important do you think a graduate degree is in the arts or business, since you have both?
Yeah, I think the idea of importance it's really interesting. For me, I want to acknowledge the tremendous privilege that I've had in having access to that education. And for me, it was essential because I wouldn't have even known that this space existed without having gone through my path at NYU. And so kind of, I guess, on a personal discovery level, on my own education, it was essential. does the industry demand it? No, not necessarily. And again, it kind of depends where you want to end up, but it feels more important to be able to show work and show your point of view and the tool set that you bring to the table, rather than necessarily a particular qualification.
Got it. That makes sense. Thank you. You mentioned code and learning to code and playing with code. What code do you feel is important? Like, where do people get started?
Yeah, I think what's kind of great is if you have the time and the discipline, really everything is available to be taught online. So I guess maybe more at the more advanced level, you're looking at like coding in C# to use a kind of coding environment or a game engine environment called Unity, which is where a lot of these type of interactive works are created. But I think that, even if you don't necessarily code, there are a lot of kind of like entry-level apps that kind of can get you into the space of playing with technology. Something really fun that I've been playing with lately is a free app called Displayland, display.land. And it allows you to kind of create volumetric scans of your environment just using your phone. So it's a little bit finicky if you're a first-time user, but it's like totally accessible and basically like a really easy entry point for you to start creating kind of volumetric content, 3D content, with the tools that you probably have with you in your hand right now.
Yeah, yeah. Many of us have smartphones or access to that. That's really cool. Speaking of having access and how critical it is at a time like now, all of the things that are happening right now, is it difficult? You mentioned Sony and Sony Music. Is it difficult for independent producers to get funding? And what are some resources that you could recommend for fundraising or for seeking out financing for projects for these kinds of experiences?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been difficult to get financing. I mean, in this field, but my background in film as well, it's the same playing field where there's limited pots of funding available. So I guess it follows a similar kind of formula where you can try and approach like grant funding institutions. There's a lot more public funding available in Europe, and so co-productions are often really a great way to go. And I guess in the US, there are probably quite a number of kind of robust kind of arts funding programs. But again, it's there's always more people in need of production funding than pots of money available. So I think in particular, like if folks are just getting started, I just really advocate that you don't need to wait until you have a 6-figure budget in order to start. I think that there's a lot of really, really exciting kind of creative collaboration happening, kind of just at an experimental prototyping phase. And I think in particular with this space, even if you go to the most prestigious festivals in the world, a lot of projects do kind of feel a little bit rough around the edges because they are more about experimentation and trying to push the medium forward and figure out what's possible rather than perfecting it. And so if you can get together a team of friends with different creative skill sets, I think there's a lot that you can do without needing expensive equipment.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and your expertise and your time with us. We really appreciate it. So thank you. And we will definitely include a lot of those resources that you mentioned and information in the wrap up that we send to everyone. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Okay, so our next presenter, let me go through my notes. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Our next guest is Gabrielle Campatiello, who is currently Talent Acquisition Partner at Warner Music Group. Hey, Gabby.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
Thank you so much.
Thank
you to everyone from NYU. Really happy that this event has been put together and excited to be here and speak to you all.
We're so happy to have you. Thank you for making the time and for being here to share your expertise. Take it away, please.
Thank you. Yeah. So as mentioned, I'm a talent acquisition partner at Warner Music Group. And really the bulk of my interaction with the changes our company has been making in response to COVID-19 is really through the lens of an employer. So I have been able to speak to, and I speak to constantly with the leadership and really the stakeholders in our business, and have been able to really gather and share with you all as a business how we've been pivoting and flexing during this unprecedented time. So some of our main concerns during the pandemic have really been centered around three groups of people: our employees, our artists, and our consumers. So when I speak about employees, I really mean present and future. In a normal month in the New York office, we're hiring anywhere between 25 to 50 positions, with internship positions on top of that. So this has really been a time where we've had to identify what hiring positions are business critical, and if our definition of business critical is even accurate considering the current situation. So keeping employees and candidates engaged has really been a top priority of ours, and the wider HR teams as well. So in efforts to keep our employees engaged and interacting with their fellow coworkers, we've launched a program across the company where their help may be needed, and they'll be able to volunteer for other departments and teams within Warner Music Group. So this is called Go Contribute, and it allows employees with bandwidth to volunteer for projects across the company. This really means that someone who sits within customer service, who may normally be working in a warehouse that produces merch for artists that is closed because of the pandemic, is able to raise their hand and offer support to the litigation team and work on a copyright infringement project that they would have never been able to touch. So this program has really allowed dozens of employees the opportunity to learn new skills in a low-risk environment, while teams with large projects have been offered helping hands. So this development of our people really has always been a top priority of ours, but I think in light of recent events, it's even more important because we need to connect and facilitate the interaction between our employees, especially because we're not getting that in-person interaction that you normally would every day in the office. So we've been able to break down the silos that are naturally created, and through this program, we're not only able to make efficient use of some employees' free time, but we've created these interdepartmental connections that will really continue to give life to a culture of connectivity and inclusivity beyond the life cycle of the pandemic. So that's a little bit on internally what we're doing with our people. And then in regard to the release and publication of music, Warner has really been encountered with new challenges during the pandemic, with no live public music venues, no studios open to mix and master the music and to even record it. The question of how are we going to make and distribute music has been at the forefront. So thankfully, we live in an age where traditional barriers of widespread distribution are really irrelevant. So artists can release and share their music at their fingertips, which you may have all experienced so far through Instagram or Twitter or whatnot. And the ability for any artist to release music on digital platforms runs in parallel with the oversaturation of content within the digital service providers, which really makes it difficult for artists to stand out. So now more than ever, we need to invest in artists who we personally can create these long-term global careers for. This really means continuing to drive our A&R teams who scout and sign all new artists. And really A&R will drive the company along with marketing our artists and songwriters. So it definitely has become a time where, we see a lot of artists on Spotify, on Apple Music, on SoundCloud, and we need A&R to kind of pinpoint who those standout artists are going to be, because it's a time where there's so much saturation on those platforms, and it's very easy for a great artist to be missed. So that's a big reason why we're investing more in our A&R teams, and international markets as well. They're pivotal for the growth of our company. And, while we have many teams asking themselves in a time where travel is restricted, how do we continue to foster our international relationships? ADA is a distribution and artist services branch of Warner Music Group that supports independent record labels, and they specifically have been faced with this challenge. With a team that's on the road a lot, they're used to remote working odd hours, so that's not a challenge for them. But where they really are challenged is that they thrive on building these personal relationships in different markets. So they'll definitely need to do some catching up on that once, the pandemic has come down and they're able to travel again. But really, as we all know, business doesn't just happen within office hours. It's happening in those offsite, in-person dinner, drinks, moments that just are invaluable. So because of these international markets and how pivotal they are to our growth, we're really trying to not only focus on local talent that's prevalent in many countries, but it's really important for us to pursue artists that cross boundaries and borders and whose breakthrough can really be felt on a global scale. So there's a growth to be uncovered in international markets, and Warner has been putting their efforts into expanding our rosters in China, Indonesia, Poland, Russia, South Africa, just to name a few. And in summary, really, our two main focuses right now are that A&R, including the signing, developing, and nurturing of artists and songwriters, and expanding our global footprint have been our two major business agendas. And in summary, I would really say being flexible and comfortable with change is invaluable during times like these. The bottom line is really that no one knows how things are going to operate moving forward. Our research and analysis team is constantly forming insights on how the pandemic has affected our business so far, and really in efforts to help predict what's to come. But it is a dynamic, ever-changing situation, so we really have to be prepared to adjust as quickly as we understand more of what's happening.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I'm also learning so much from everyone who's sharing, so thank you.
Yeah, of course.
A few questions for you if you have a moment.
Absolutely.
So the music industry, right, as you've discussed, has undergone so many changes in the last 10 years in particular. Mm-hmm. And you talked about areas for growth and how A&R is going to drive the business and international appeal. On the entry level or internship level, like where are the roles that drive, from someone who is external, outside of the company, what are the roles and in what departments are really going to drive growth and make opportunities for recent graduates?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that two teams right now that we're really trying to beef up and have, fully stocked would really be the international teams and our research and analysis teams. Amidst the pandemic, we are still hiring in those departments constantly. We're even expanding those teams. So I would say that really, the analysts needed to look at market and partner insights are needed in times like these to address areas of change that the business is facing, a guide to leadership, a guide to the labels on how to budget and prepare going forward. We really need forward-thinking, new ideas, fresh employees who are constantly in the mindset of innovation. Because I think if anything that we've really learned from this is that we can't be innovative when it's too late. We don't want to backtrack again. So we definitely want people who are going to come in with new ideas and able to, lend that to teams like international label operations, international commerce, research and analytics. Definitely big ones for us right now.
That's awesome. Thank you. And for some of those roles, I don't know if you can answer this, or maybe you can speak generally across the music industry. Do you see the number of entry-level roles or roles in general? Like I know you're looking at mission-critical roles. Right. Do you see that number contracting or shrinking just because we are in like an uncertain critical time?
Yeah, definitely. And I would say, especially for entry-level roles, those are usually the roles we see at the coordinator or assistant level. And those have been our roles that if they were open, we've put them on pause for right now. I think that it's a moment where no one is leaving the company either. I think security is definitely huge for people. So we haven't had to open new roles. And for the time being, until we have kind of a further understanding of our return to office plan, most of the entry-level roles will probably remain on hold. And that's kind of the pattern I've been seeing across many music companies. So I would say that until we have a bit more information on when we can be back in the office, depending on local governments, then we'll have a better understanding of when those roles will reopen, or if we're interested in kind of reframing that role to be a virtual or remote kind of position. I think some of those assistant positions are really pivotal for that kind of in-person learning directly from the person you're supporting in the office. So I think that's why we've kind of taken a pause on hiring for those roles at the moment.
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. Are there things then that, you know, the roles that you mentioned where there is the most opportunity for growth at the entry level, are there, in absence of internships, are there things and skills that people can be working on independently that will make them stand out for you? You know, you talked about being flexible and adaptable. Are there things that stand out for you on people's resumes or in their applications that can help demonstrate that in absence of internship or like connections?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially right now, you know, we're getting an overwhelming amount of applications. So it's definitely harder than ever to stand out. And I would say, like, if there were 3 things to advise, I would say definitely being specific. I think the more keywords, skills, certifications you can add to your resume, it just automatically makes you more discoverable. So if you're in an application of, you know, 4,000 applicants, which is the numbers we're seeing right now, you know, and I'm searching for someone who has a specific skill or has worked with something like Music Connect before, you go from 1 of 4,000 to 1 of 50 immediately. So I think that's a huge one for me that I find is really helpful, especially on paper when you haven't had a chance to speak to anyone yet. I think finding platforms for communication. I really do invite anyone to message recruiters or industry members who work at the company that you've applied to a position at. I know that some people are hesitant to do that sometimes because of, you know, the image that it may create or that it may make them look desperate or whatnot. I think that there's always value in increasing your chances of being seen, and making sure your message is professional and to the point, expresses your interest in the position and the company within a paragraph. I think there is definitely no harm in doing that, and more often than not, it gets you seen and passed on to the right person. So I think that that's a huge, that's definitely, you know, an asset on your side that you should, you know, do if you haven't. And being active on LinkedIn, I think there are some roles right now that some companies are not creating active searches for. They may be confidential, they may not want to post or publicize the role yet. So they're not relying on applications for that kind of role. And basically they're going to find you rather you finding them. So make sure everything is on there. You know, there may be opportunities, skills, certifications, accomplishments that maybe you haven't been able to upload all on your LinkedIn. That's, you know, how you're going to be found. So make sure it looks active and it doesn't just look like you created one and haven't used it since.
Perfect. I think that's really excellent advice. I think we have time for one more question. And thank you. You've answered like all of the questions that have been through. In terms of going back to A&R for a second, you talked about, you know, and I know from my friends at Sony Music, like they're, you know, you're looking for someone with crossover appeal, someone who can have international appeal. Are there things in terms of that, are there any, to me, it seems so nebulous and like, you know, when you know it, when you find it and you know it, like, is the data important or big streaming numbers important? Like, what are some of the other factors that go into like the A&R team's decisions, if you can speak to that?
In terms of who they're moving forward with and signing.
Who they're sourcing or who they're thinking about signing, or, you know, just for the true musician, creative people out there, like, or people who producers who want to attach themselves to talent. Like what are some of the things that help you get noticed from the talent?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely can't speak as well to that as probably someone in A&R, but I would definitely say that there are so many platforms, you know, different ways of being seen that I think our A&R people have been targeting, especially now, because a huge, you know, way of finding and scouting artists for them used to be live underground events and that they would go to. So they've definitely been getting into some deep YouTube holes and, you know, SoundCloud. So I think that, and honestly, especially seeing where the music community is gravitating towards in terms of who they're sharing, who they're liking a lot, and trying to be the first big label to jump on that person. So I think that that's kind of been, you know, social media has been their saving grace in this situation. And I think absolutely, just like your LinkedIn for your, you know, professional career and your job search, I think absolutely, if you are a creative, you should be using your Instagram more than ever right now and really highlighting all of your work. because that's really how you're going to be seen by a lot of teams at this time.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all your insights and valuable knowledge. We really appreciate you being here and sharing with us today, Gabby.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you so much, Gabby. Our next guest is Eric Ting, and unfortunately, our originally planned host, Eric Louie, was not able to attend, but we're so lucky to have Eric Ting here. He is an Obie Award-winning director and currently the artistic director of Cal Shakes, which is the California Shakespeare Theater. Welcome, Eric. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Absolutely. You got the other Asian Eric.
We're so lucky. We'll take all of you.
Yes.
Everyone welcome. Eric, did you have anything that you wanted to start off speaking about, or should we jump into the questions right away?
Let's jump into the questions. I literally just found out about this like a few hours ago. So
yeah, which is why we're so happy you're here.
I'm glad to be here.
Okay, so the first question, that I wanted to talk about the first question I have is, what are some ways, you're the artistic director, like we're in this crazy situation. What are some ways that you and your company are thinking about reimagining the future of theater in the context of this pandemic?
Sure. I would say that of the many arts industries, live performance is the one that's probably been the hardest hit by this pandemic. And so a lot of us in the industry have, I would say we're still getting over a bit of paralysis, right? Like that it's sort of like, what are you when you can no longer produce theater? It's been challenging. I think that certainly you've seen institutions start to look to creating digital content, and that digital content is often like it began initially as organizations streaming recordings of productions that they were able to grab before the theater shut down, right? And then that particular thread has transitioned now into organizations trying to stream archival footage of past productions. And I think in general, what we're finding in this country, and I can speak for myself, can't speak for anybody else, but what I will say for myself is that, a lot of the streaming content that we have access to in this country is really nothing compared to the streaming content that's coming out of, say, Europe, or what you find with like Broadway HD or NT Live, right? So in those instances, you've got multi-camera productions that are shot over multiple performances with no live audience, et cetera, et cetera. And so it becomes very difficult to kind of compete with that. So a lot of our nonprofit organizations have been using that tool, I would say primarily as a way to stay connected with their patron base. And then beyond that, what you're starting to find is in very small, I keep saying these feel like very minuscule gestures, right? Because I think so many of us built our kind of experience of this form on this notion of being in the company of other people, right? In close proximity with other people. Even the process of making it is often about being in a small room and in an intimate space, kind of, sharing breath.
Shared experience. It's shared experience.
Yeah. We talk a lot about the collective breath, right? And so, I would say that what you do find a lot of is there are some innovations happening around digital content, and I think the things that excite me most tend to be the work within digital that's using the kind of digital platform as a way to capture or to create generative creative content, but to do it in a way that also captures the live experience. And that the more that we can lift up that kind of being in a shared moment with each other, if we can't be in a shared space, right? So being in that shared moment is, I think, a really extraordinary thing. And I would say it's interesting, right? Because I think from my perspective, we've seen theaters basically, it's happening in waves, but like it's like how one deals with grief, right? And so you see each of the phases, and each phase has been sort of pushing the return date further and further and further down the road. So a lot of organizations right now are, I would say, for better or worse, more consumed by this notion of life support than about life affirmation. So we're trying to figure out how to get back.
Got it. I love that idea of the shared moment. That's very profound.
Yeah. Some folks might have seen, there was a recent production that Bard College produced with Ashley Tata and the students at Bard College. And I think Tefana, co-presented it here or in New York City, right? And it was essentially a production of Mad Force that was done over a sort of advanced form of Zoom, where the production was able to control kind of like a lot of the different shapes. And what you're finding is, there's a kind of very deep shift in the sort of production where now the design is it's almost like they sent packages. They essentially sent little boxes, little kits to all of the artists. That included like the microphone and the green, the green screen.
Got it. So there's this idea of a production behind the production, and how do you get everyone set up at home to make this sort of interactive but collective experience? That's amazing.
Yeah.
That is very cool. Is it?
I was gonna say, I think what's kind of really interesting about it is a little bit, this is the moment that we're in, right? So I think that this period of social distancing is that we're going to slowly kind of come out of it. I do think that with the theater world in particular, because we have such a relatively old audience, that we're not going to be returning into those kinds of giant public gatherings, right? And that theaters, I think many of our organizations are very skittish around what it means to produce with proper social distancing protocols, because that's essentially compromising and accepting 30% house capacities, right? And nobody thinks that's good business. And so, a lot of the, I would say I run a Shakespeare theater, and so what's kind of really special about this moment is that the moment is forcing us out of like what I would offer has been a trend towards large spectacle in the theater, right? So we've been moving towards spectacle in the live theater. And what we find ourselves in right now is a space where that spectacle is largely unavailable to us. Like the spectacle of the world is far greater than any spectacle of a show. And so this moment of being kind of in a space with you and in a space with folks on a screen, it really is coming down to the kind of actor's craft again, and the kind of essence of storytelling, and how are we communicating the journey.
I love that. That is very profound. So speaking in terms of that and everything that's going on in the world, and I'm going to bypass a different question that I had, but
sure.
In this time, like how you talk about sort of like micro theater or things becoming more intimate as opposed to spectacle, how do you think we can take theater and have it, if the audience is aging out, how do we make it appealing for younger people and have it continue to be a critical art form and social commentary at a time when we are isolated from each other and we're, economically marginalized? Like, how does theater help how are you thinking about theater virtually making opportunities for people?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because I think that a crisis like this accelerates change. So anytime there's a global crisis, changes accelerate. And I think those of us that have been working in the industry have noted for a long time, right, that the form of theater as we have known it has been in a decline for quite a long time. And so what we're going to find right now probably is an acceleration of that. But I would also then look back to kind of earlier, one part of what was contributing to this accelerating to this decline of the theater, right, was a kind of democratization of art and culture. Sort of, the technology was making it so that we all had access to become makers. We all had access to a platform, right? And that platform was no longer defined by the kind of the local community that you were in, but it actually expanded globally, right? And so I think from my perspective, what happens right now is my crazy thinking is that we're in the middle right now of dismantling this kind of decades-long model, and that the model of the sort of regional theater with a subscription base, or any of those nonprofit theaters with a subscription base, that's largely going to be put on hold, if not completely dismantled. And we're going to move away from this notion of a kind of promised, season of plays that people subscribe to. And to your point of social justice, what I would say is like, there are themes of social justice that happen in our stories, but I think more importantly right now, what we're looking at is an opportunity to transform the landscape of the American theater in a way that actually brings it, that brings it more up to date with the sort of demands of our social practice today, right? Like, I think one of the challenges around being a theater that produces a subscription season is that many of these organizations have largely been a servant to that subscription base. And when we talk about what is made, that subscription base is made up of, we're largely seeing a kind of monolith, right? Like, nothing's a monolith, but like when you look at the normal subscription base, you're looking at upper middle class, white, and older. And so what happens when you dismantle the subscription model is that all of a sudden these theaters are now no longer having to program to that base. And once we can stop programming to that base, we can start taking bigger risks, right?
Totally.
And that's something that I'm super excited about.
That's awesome. I have so many questions about your Macbeth 1969, but we're going to save that for one more question for you. So talking about this dismantling of model and the subscription theater, given how things are changing, once the pandemic is, whatever the future state holds, and when we can start gathering together, even if it's at limited capacity, do you think that fellowships and internships will still be offered at theaters? What do you think the opportunities are for these entry-level roles, or for mentorships? How does someone get to where you are when the system has been dismantled and funding has dried up?
Yeah. I think the beauty of theater is that it doesn't take a whole lot to access, right? So like, I think if you're already in a position where you're largely willing to work for very little money, right, in exchange for experience, like, let's say that's the space that you're in, I would say go make theater, right? Like, this is like, never been a better time to kind of there's never been a better time to just kind of like take massive risks and fail like beautifully, right? And I think so many of our young artists kind of entering into the workforce today are actually, a generation of artists that have a kind of facility with this platform that most of the folks that are working at these larger institutions don't have. And so this notion of like redefining what the form is, that's largely on the new emerging young artists that are coming in. Yeah, completely, right? So like, I would say yes, of course there's going to be, you're talking to somebody who runs a theater in California. So we were literally dealing with AB5, which was all about dismantling internships and like unpaid fellowships and all that stuff right before all of this went down. Yeah. So it's hard to talk about that because in part we were setting ourselves up to try and address the inequities within the field, right? Like, we wanted to create a space where folks who didn't normally have the background to imagine a life in the arts could suddenly start working because there wasn't an expectation of that kind of internship model. But I have no question that like a lot of that, like this crisis and I think the subsequent recession is going to move a lot of that work a few steps back. So a little bit, it's like, if there's an opportunity to do it, which there will be, embrace that opportunity. But I think help us as a field regain that ground and move us forward.
Got it. That's so encouraging and inspiring that at the end of the day, like, hopefully this will make more access and more opportunity, and the redefinition is a hopeful thing as opposed to like, oh my God, what are we gonna do?
Yeah.
Amazing. Eric, thank you so much for being here with us today on such short notice, and so answering so many questions and giving us hope for the future of theater at a very dark time.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We appreciate it. Hi. Thanks again, Eric. And our next guest is Jay Francis, who is currently VP of Current Series and Diversity and Inclusion for Disney Television Animation. Hi, Jay.
Hey, Rebecca, how are you?
I'm here. How are you?
Doing okay, thank you. Well, thank you, and thank everyone at NYU, Lily and Ro and all the gang. So I'm really happy to be here today. And like you, I'm learning a lot. So this is pretty cool. So As Rebecca said, my name is Jay Francis, Vice President of Current Series and Diversity Inclusion at Disney Television Animation. For those who don't know what we do, we produce animated series for several platforms, Disney Channel, Disney XD, Disney Junior, and most recently our streaming service, Disney Plus. So Gravity Falls, Phineas and Ferb, DuckTales, Big City Greens, Elena of Abelard, Doc McStuffins. That's some of the projects that you're probably familiar with. So I want to just jump right in. I know time is of the essence. So the question about how the pandemic has affected TV animation, and specifically us at TVA. It's funny when you really think about it. I think the TV animation business was almost built on the assumption that we didn't all need to be in the same place at the same time. Writers go to their offices to write. Artists go to their desks to draw. Editors sit in these dark rooms with their edit bays. It's been convenient, certainly, to have all of this happen under one roof, but was it really necessary? Generally speaking, I think most creators in our world are very much okay being in their own heads. So the challenge really for us was making sure that everyone not only had the hardware and the software and the equipment that they needed to do the job, but perhaps more importantly, a well-built communication system that allowed everyone to connect with each other. So animation on the TV levels, for us, we are certainly up and running. Our IT department did a masterful job in getting our teams up and running within a week of a stay-home order. Listen, not every editor had a home editing suite. Not every storyboard artist, writer, or executive or assistant had a home office for which they could just turn on the lights and say, bingo, I'm ready. So a lot of work went into getting our studio working remotely in a short period of time. So while we can be thankful that our process of doing business allows for our ability to keep moving forward, this does come with a host of challenges and concerns. And I think first and foremost, I think if you look at any successful film, TV show, or video game, or play, as Eric was mentioning, you need to acknowledge that most likely there was an incredible spirit of collaboration and chemistry between the entire crew. One of the real challenges of this process is feeling the disconnect between teammates. Some of the best ideas come from folks sitting around in a big room and just joking and having fun. There's also some logistical issues like the quality of voice, sound, and music recording. Lots of home studios, lots of closets. Still remains to be seen how the overall quality of these shows made during the pandemic will match up against their pre-pandemic mates. So, but I really believe what the pandemic has done is force studios and quite frankly, all businesses to reassess how reasonable workflow can be maintained without everybody every day needing to be shuttled into a single building or a designated space. The learnings of this experience very definitely could provide opportunity to better solve the work-life balance that most people try to attain while recognizing that we still need direct human interaction, both on a personal and a professional level. Specifically for the TV animation business, I foresee a sort of hybrid experience of both an on-campus and a remote workflow that better supports a more rewarding and best practices work experience. So, for us, again, we were, a week after the stay-home order, our IT department had us up and running at probably 75% capacity. And we're now up to 90. So we really haven't missed a beat too much in terms of, some of the questions that may arise from this situation, and sort of stating that we're up and running. Question comes up about, oh, well, are you still hiring then? And I've, sort of piggyback on what I've heard prior to this. It's like, it really depends. I mean, we had a couple of Disney Junior shows that were greenlit literally maybe 3 or 4 days before the stay-home order. So that show now was in production, and the working remote aspect of it really couldn't sort of undo the schedule and the production process that we needed to have. So there are literally some people we've hired at this point who have not stepped foot in a Disney-owned building or have an office. So That's been pretty interesting. But yes, I sort of running off of what Gabby said earlier, it's just like, some of our jobs we're still looking for, but there's been a pause, there's been a freeze, as I'm sure most of you have read, in terms of the impact that the pandemic has had on Disney, with the closures of all the parks worldwide and the cruise lines and the movie theaters closing. Disney's been hit pretty hard. So, all of us have tried and want to be sensitive to that. But at the same time, you look at, the animation businesses, which is one of the businesses that can still sort of move forward. And, even our live action colleagues over at Disney Channel can only go as far as sort of doing the writing and doing setups, but ultimately they can't put anything into production, which puts a lot of weight on the animation team, a weight that we're absolutely happy to take on, because just from the standpoint of, thankful that, again, we have positions, but also just to provide some comfort, just to provide comfort to our employees, but to provide comfort to our audience. I mean, we've been doing short form content that we've been putting out very quickly. Disney Feature Animation has been doing that as well. So there are things you can do with animation that you can't do in live action. So I think it's been very important for the morale of the teams, and for kids who are stuck at home, watching TV. Now that school seems to be finishing up, we've been happy to provide that service. So, Rebecca, should I be given my 3 actionable tips?
Oh my gosh, yes, please give your tips. And also I have so many questions for you.
Okay. Well, Lily had said, I do a lot of these Zoom presentations, and typically I've let the students sort of dictate where I take the conversation, because a company like Disney, and Sony too, there's just like, there's so many different divisions and people have so many different questions. Like, I work in the animation department, but you can't know how many questions I've got about Star Wars Galaxy Land. and when is this show going to be on Disney Plus?
Jay, when is the pandemic going to end?
Yes, exactly. But let me run through these tips real fast. And again, I'm coming from an animation space, so that's really what I am sort of focused on here. Look, if you're a writer, write. If you're an artist, draw. Notwithstanding the amount of work currently produced in the animation space, you're walking into one of the most difficult and challenging job markets in history. Make sure you're getting better at your craft each day while you are trying to attack that same job market. Stay connected. Reach out to your school, career, and alumni offices to acquire leads and contacts. I can't speak for everyone in this industry, but working remotely has given me a time to update and connect with people through the LinkedIns of the world. I'm not a Twitter guy. I'm not a Facebook guy. I do a lot of my work on LinkedIn. And it's one of those things where, let's be honest, human nature is such that there's no one looking over your shoulder while you're working right now. Oh, let me go play around a little bit. I think if most people are sort of doing that, then there's a time, they're more accessible now, I think, to sort of wanting to have that connection, number one, but you also might find them hanging out there while you're doing that. So, but it's a good way to connect. And I think it might've been Gabby who was talking about that as well. It's just like, look, the worst thing that can happen if you reach out to someone politely on LinkedIn is they don't respond to you. Okay, move on to the next.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think a lot of people do look to help, especially in these times. I really think they do. So, I would also, I would really push joining different groups and organizations that will provide you with an entry to the animation industry while you're searching for that job. Women in Animation, ASIFA, Latinx in Animation, Black and Animated. There's a lot of these groups that you can do and join up with right now. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And, we all know not every job is posted. So, how you connect with people in the industry. You still have to be skilled. You have to be talented. That's what's going to sustain any job you get. But, going to a women in animation screening when, when we are back to gathering, but I even think they do it via Zoom now. So meeting people who are coming from all different studios who you might not otherwise meet, I think is a perfect way to start to, build out your connections before you even get that job. And again, I can't, I sort of made a reference to it earlier. It's just like, take advantage of the schools, your alumni. I think NYU, I will say, and Lily knows this to be true, NYU, I feel, has an incredibly strong alumni program. I did a presentation there last year, and I asked for writers to send me samples, and they sent me samples. And I will give credit where credit's due to Lily. She said, let me put a little note in the alumni, whatever. I don't know if it goes out weekly or monthly, whatever, but I was inundated with NYU scripts to this day. And look, we've hired several apprentice writers for our team from the NYU samples I've received. So I would highly recommend, look, you've paid them a lot of money, right? Let's
Yes.
it up a little bit, so
all the money.
Yeah, so that's sort of my 3 sort of things you can be doing right now while you're trying to get that job.
I love that. That's so helpful. I love that you mentioned the women in animation. I think I got a job, a writing job, from meeting someone in line at a signing at an ASIFA event. So it does, like, I'm proof. Like, it does, like, just chat up the person next to you in line, and then 2 years later they'll call you when they need somebody. So
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I did want to ask you a couple of questions, Jay. So you sort of covered, like, what are you looking at right now? Normally there are festivals and pitches. Do you have an unsolicited pitch process? Where are you looking at inspiration? I know there's so many great comics and artists on Instagram, TikTok. Like, how are you sourcing new creative ideas right now?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Obviously, a company the size of Disney, there's like sort of different areas that people cover. In my former days, I used to be a recruiter for Film Roman, so I would go to different schools and look for artists for The Simpsons and King of the Hill and Family Guy. In my job right now, I focus more on writers and potential show creators, but it's the animation business. We know writers are artists, artists are writers, show creators are artists and writers. There's a lot of different crossover there. So, but we do have an art and animation recruitment team. So they handle the sort of looking for new talent for artists. And so you'll find them at Cal Arts and Ringling and Savannah and SVA and those type of schools. Where for me, I'm going to be going to schools that either have fairly high profile writing programs, or quite frankly, schools that just really cater to a diverse population, because I sort of have that twofold aspect to what my job is.
And what are the materials that you're looking for? Like, what are some things that help?
Well,
is it a portfolio? Is it a script? Is it?
Yeah, it's pretty black and white. I mean, I want to read samples, and I want to read samples that that our crews and our other executives would find move the needle for us, and we can sort of delve into that a little bit. But I think the reality is that when a crew is looking for a potential writer, whether it's a staff writer or an apprentice writer, the first thing they want to see is like, okay, do you know how to write it in a standard format that is going to be the standard format of our business? So, in looking for sample scripts, if I'm looking for an 11-minute or a 22-minute script, it needs to be formatted properly. It needs, you want to give that sense of security. It's just like, okay, the only thing I have to focus here on is the content and nothing else. So that's typically, and I typically like original pilots versus specs. I'll read specs, but I like original pilots just because it tells me about your style, the way you handle characters, your sense of humor, your point of view. So that's why I sort of like originals a little bit better. But we get people sending me features and 1-hour dramas, and these could be the best well-written scripts ever. But I'm not going to be able to give that to the guy.
But you're making animated TV shows.
Yeah, I'm not, the guy in Big City Greens doesn't want to read a Criminal Minds. He's just not going to, do that.
Yeah.
So I think it's just important to, but it's really as simple as, if you now have my, and certainly Lily has my contact information, but I send a release and an NDA and people send me their samples and I read it and, we talk about, what I liked, what didn't work for me, and we go from there, so.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And then can you just talk really quickly, or, we don't we're a little tight on time, but I was hoping to ask you, how obviously there's Disney Plus and Hulu that have launched as part of like a vehicle for distribution. And you guys have done, and I know Sony Animation everyone has sort of pivoted. Animation in this space is something that people can do from home. It is something that's much easier to do, something that of the caliber that we have been expecting for distribution.
Sure.
At home. But how have platforms like Twitch and TikTok and YouTube changed the traditional television animation business for you?
For us immediately, it hasn't that much. I mean, so now there's places, obviously there's additional places to advertise our stuff, so that's always important. But I think for us, where we look at the Twitch and where we look at TikTok and these type of things is in terms of potential talent. So as much as I was talking to you about, hey, if I'm looking for a writer, I want it in this format, there's a whole host of areas that Disney looks for creative talent, whether it's, voice records, whether it's our short form, obviously we do live action on Disney Channel. So maybe you find your next Raven in somebody on TikTok. In fact, I guarantee there'll be some people coming out of TikTok from this pandemic who now are going to be stars because I've seen them, like just amazing. 100%. So, I mean, it hasn't dramatically changed as yet, just from the standpoint that the pipeline for us, I gave you all 4 of those platforms, there's still a big, heavy business for us. And, a company like Disney, be honest, I mean, the strength, there's a certain strength in our sides, but, there's also that, we got to pivot. Okay. It's like driving the Titanic. It's like, there's the iceberg, but, can you, straighten it out? Typically we just make it, but I think, all of the research that, the R&D that we do in terms of new technology and whatnot, it's all there, sort of talking about VR and that type of stuff. There are areas of the company that are, very deep into that. But in terms of the sort of everyday, day-to-day right now, we still have pipelines to fill in terms of our distribution model. And for as much as we talk about cutting the cord and streaming and whatnot, there are a lot of people who aren't streaming, and cable is still there, and Disney Channel and Disney XD and Disney Junior is still an important aspect of that. So, adding the streaming service makes a lot of sense for a whole host of reasons, especially given, when we had the Fox merger and what have you. But our business, the sort of traditional linear broadcast and cable business is certainly not done from our perspective. So, and there's still business to be had there, and there's still creativeness to sort of to go through that process.
Well, as a distribution executive, I love to hear that. So
I know you do. I know you do.
I have one more question for you. And I know I've been told that we need to move on and be mindful of everyone's time, but I did want to touch on one thing with you, simply because, part of your title and your role is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think I would be remiss, because it's something that's so important to me. I wanted to ask you, how has the pandemic and the events of the last 2 weeks and the last 40, 50 years, like how have recent events, has it changed your approach to recruitment, mentorship, retention? We are having these conversations internally at Sony. So.
Yeah, we are too. I mean, look, the reality of the situation is this whole diversity inclusion expansion of my job is not all that is fairly new to begin with. So, we've been sort of taking, I think Disney and I think most entertainment studios have always been sincere about the idea, but you know, just there wasn't an urgency, there wasn't a priority, and you know, whether it's partly on the Me Too movement or sort of the loss in ratings and whatnot, we you know, I think there was a recognition that we have to start to put our money where our mouth is, and so you know, even the fact that I have this job now and that I've been sort of picked to help foster, at least in a small way, sort of some of these D&I initiatives, I respect Disney for that. We're in a whole new category now, and to the degree that you asked me, like, what's good in terms of the pandemic and what have you, the only thing I can say is, like, I was in Zoom meetings all the way up until I got to here, and I'm going back to them afterwards because we're like sort of in the throes of not only, you know, messaging and how we're approaching this, but a real sort of deep dive into, you know, we can't just put a message out there and then not follow up with some real actionable things that we're going to do. This time is just, I know like what's different about this time. I think on a whole host of levels, this time is a little bit different. And you know, I'm working with a lot of our senior execs, which I'm happy to do in terms of just trying to figure out and getting more sort of opinions on how to approach this. But yeah, I mean, we are sort of digging deep into what are the next steps for us, and not just what the little card on LinkedIn says, but what is it that we're going to do? What is, you know, not what today is bringing about, but what's 2 weeks from now? What are we doing? You know, that's what I'm really sort of looking at, harnessing a little bit. So.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah. It's like, you know, we can have these messages, but like, what are we doing to foster leadership and grow people's careers and like bring people in and grow them and give them opportunities. So thank you so much, Jay. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. And I will bring it over to our last and final guest, Eric Cohn. Thank you, Jay. And very excited to bring Eric in. Hello, final guest, who is currently executive editor and chief critic at IndieWire. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you for having me. I'm incredibly intimidated to follow all those amazing speakers and to be the second Eric too, man. It's a lot.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. Thank you so much for being here. Please take it away. We're thrilled to have you here.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's really great hearing everybody beforehand, actually, because it gives me a lot to think about in terms of the value of these events and just how much of a vital industry we're working in right now that's constantly changing. And so I think one of the things that I'd like to stress, being in the context of an event like this, is that I'm happy to talk about career opportunities in media, which is specifically where I work, but also would hope to be able to offer some guidance in terms of anyone looking to generate media for your career in other kinds of ways, because I think that part of the conversation is often lost in this process and is very important too, especially with people who are creating work that will be getting out in the world. So I want to talk a bit about that in a few different ways. Over the last few months, one of the questions that I've been getting a lot when I talk to people on the phone, sources for stories or things like that, is how are you holding up? And that question is one that is difficult for me to answer without saying, first and foremost, I'm really busy and not necessarily as concerned about how I'm holding up personally than I am how I'm getting through each day in an incredibly challenging news cycle. And you can see from the speakers over the course of this event that the industry is just filled with stories and everything is in constant flux. And so it's an incredibly exciting time as a journalist, especially as an entertainment journalist, to be looking at film and TV and emerging technologies because so much is happening on a day-to-day basis. And one of the reasons why that's really valuable for us has to do with the history of our site. So I'd like to tell you just a little bit about that. And IndieWire in particular, some of you may be familiar with more than others, but we've been around almost 25 years now. Just in the last 15 years that I've been involved, we've been through 3 different owners. And most recently, in 2016, we were acquired by a company called Penske Media, which is a growing media company that tends to acquire distressed properties, so media brands that kind of need the help. that a bigger company might provide, but have an established brand. So we were one of those acquisitions. Rolling Stone was one of those acquisitions, Women's Wear Daily, many others. And it's a very interesting sort of growing empire of sorts. And I've enjoyed being a part of that process at an earlier stage. So I would just say, it's sort of a preamble, we are not hiring right now, although things are constantly changing, but Penske Media is. And if you're interested in a job in entertainment journalism, to check the Penske Media job site, because it's constantly being updated. Now, specifically with respect to IndieWire, what I would say is that we are well situated to be dealing with this situation over the course of the last few weeks, because we have always been a very nimble, digitally savvy brand. And that goes back to our roots starting in 1996 at the Sundance Film Festival, where we were basically a kind of email newsletter when that was a kind of radical concept, and finding our footing in a community of sort of DIY filmmakers and artists who needed some sort of collective voice. And this was pre-social media as any of us kind of understand it right now. So that's been an incredibly valuable part of our history, is to have been on the ground at that early phase. And so we have always been a very kind of flexible team of people in terms of paying attention to changes in the media landscape and not growing too quickly. And so while when I started with the site 15 years ago, we were 2 people in no office, now we're about 24, which feels like a big growth spurt. For me, is actually relatively small compared to other media entities. And so that low overhead allows us to deal with risky situations like what we're seeing at the moment. The other thing that I think it's important to point out is that we are not just a film publication, although we cover a lot of movies and film festivals, but we are essentially interested in creative independence. And that concept is so expansive, which obviously gives us this kind of liberation in that we can cover such a wide range of topics. So over the last decade, we've extended far beyond the kind of traditional concept of independent film to cover TV, to cover web series, to cover gaming. I most recently started to learn a lot more about the XR world, so I really enjoyed Caitlin's presentation. In fact, I have an Oculus headset by my side on a regular basis now as I try to understand that space more. And all of that is layering on top of an existing ecosystem in terms of how films and other forms of content are produced and released out into the world. So in terms of how things have changed over the last few weeks, what I would stress is that it's been a process of watching the destabilization of that ecosystem and figuring out how we can be responsive to that in the most practical way. In the first couple of weeks when the shutdown started, I think it really sunk in for us that this was going to be a different kind of year when the South by Southwest Film Festival was canceled, and obviously the different components of South by Southwest as well. And we had to do our homework to figure out if the small films that didn't have distribution could still somehow have an editorial life on our site. And that required some research dealing with festivals and other festivals and sales agents and publicists to figure out if there was some way that films could opt in to be covered so we could create a life for them in spite of the fact that we didn't have a traditional kind of platform to write about them. And what we found through that process was that, yes, these films still exist and we can still write about them. And there's an incredible amount of innovation that's taken place in the last few weeks to see how those films can continue to have lives so that other entities can be responsive to them as well. So while I do think that if you look at what's going on with traditional studios and multiplexes and the kind of the master equation of how Hollywood movies are put out into the world, there's an incredible amount of destabilization there. I think that in the independent arena, there's so much more room to take risks and try new things. So look up what independent distributors are doing with virtual cinemas right now, partnering with theaters and small business owners to provide online releases to films where there's a revenue split involved. It seems to have been in a very sort of limited way, very successful for the transactional VOD business for a lot of films, and the possibility that could still be a part of the equation whenever theaters open up again is actually very exciting, because it means that for certain films that are already very hard to get out into the world, there is a new revenue stream that is being created. I can tell you anecdotally that our traffic is up because there is a lot more interest from people in terms of figuring out what they should be watching and what they should be paying attention to. So as somebody who is both a reporter and an editor, but also a critic, I think that curation is incredibly valuable right now. And I'm constantly finding new ways to talk about films that are finding their way out into the market. And whatever the new normal looks like, that kind of productivity is not going to go away. So those of us on the side of the equation where we're trying to figure out how to process this stuff for an audience are very excited to continue to find new ways to cover these films. There are movies like Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, or The Assistant that launched at festivals over the last 6 months that have very much found success in the VOD market. And it's very, very promising to me as a journalist to see that that is continuing to happen. And I also think that it's important for people to look at what film festivals are doing to try to survive. Now, I got into this racket after I graduated from NYU and was working as a freelance journalist and needed some way to feel like I was on the front lines. I needed a piece of the action. So I started going to places like Sundance and Cannes and Toronto International Film Festival, and I learned a lot about the industry that way. You can't do that right now, but those entities all still exist, and they're coming up with various kinds of contingency plans, some of which may involve finding new homes or reinventing their purpose. But if you look at what's happening this week with the Cannes Film Festival, which is announcing its lineup, even though the Cannes Film Festival isn't happening, I think it raises a very important point about why these gatekeepers exist in the first place. And I think there is something really valuable in understanding how this ecosystem came together, and that even in the current situation, it's finding ways of representing for the purposes of film culture. And I think you see that all across the industry, is that there is a real impulse among people who curate art to continue to do that in some way, shape, or form. And whatever the new normal is, that will be a part of the equation. So I want to share my final, I guess it's supposed to be a top 3, I think, but I actually have a top 4, so I hope that that's allowed. So the thoughts I wanted to share here are sort of targeted at 2 different kinds of people. One, for those of you who are interested in a job in media, but also for anyone who's interested in following a creative path and creating new work, whether it's film or TV or another media, and interested in getting that story out there. The first is, I would say, is find out what your story is. So whether that story is a film that was shot in a unique way, or a form of representation we haven't seen before, that unique angle is going to help sell that product to whether it's a journalist or a critic or an editor or somebody on that level, in a way that you otherwise wouldn't be able to if you just sort of talked about it as a drama or a comedy or something to that effect. If you're a writer, it's a similar kind of a challenge. You need to understand what the angle of the story is, and I think everyone can benefit from thinking in those terms. The second point that I would bring up here is that I think it's important for people to learn the history of the industry that you work in. And that's not just about, understanding classic Hollywood and how the studio system operated, but also the recent history, why the Sundance Film Festival matters, how it sort of played a role in the creation of a market for American independent films, what the Palme d'Or is, or why it matters that Universal collapsed the theatrical window and put Trolls World Tour on VOD much earlier than it would have been under normal circumstances. All of the answers to these questions will tell you a lot more about what kind of role you want to play in the industry. Thirdly, I would say it's important to understand how everything fits together and consider how to work within that equation. So I know a lot of people who are interested in one area of the industry and they just focus on that area in the industry, but the folks who were speaking earlier today can probably speak to this too. Everything is interconnected here. So if you are a filmmaker and you don't know what a sales agent does, or a distributor does, or a publicist does, you're missing a really crucial part of that conversation. And so I would encourage people to learn more about how that ecosystem fits together, and consider if you have some flexibility, even trying out work in some of those fields, because let's say that you're interested in writing about movies, but you can't find jobs writing about movies. Well, try publicity or marketing or something to that effect. You don't know where those paths might take you, but they may end up being just as constructive. And the fourth point, I think, is probably the most important one, and I tacked it on at the end because I realized that if I don't say it, I'll regret it later. And that's that I think it's really important that people are not afraid to be a pain in the ass. Because if you don't follow up with people and remind them that you exist, they're very easily going to move on without you. And that doesn't mean that you need to constantly hassle people or stalk them at weird hours or something to that effect. But I do think that there is a need to generate your own confidence from the sense that you have something to offer to the world. And the only way that you're going to get on someone's radar is being consistent in terms of how you do that. So if you're a journalist looking to place a story somewhere or something to that effect, and you just send out your work into the ether and you don't hear back, don't assume that following up won't lead to a better solution. And I would say if you're a filmmaker and you're working with, say, a PR team to get your story out there, don't assume that just one shot at getting it out there is all it's going to take, and if it doesn't connect, then that's it. Sometimes you really have to battle to break through that noise. And I think this is a really critical time for the art of cinema and moving images in general, given that so much of it is being manipulated. We need great storytellers and people who can help us put the world in context. So anyone who's discouraged by the challenges that our world is going through right now, I would look at it as a really extraordinary opportunity to play a role in whatever the new normal might be. So that's it.
I love all of this advice. That's so great. Thank you so much, Eric. That is really profound. And I couldn't agree more, right? Like at the studios and for Jay or for all around, like as we all pivot and try to figure these things out, like to me, like there couldn't be a better time for independent film. There isn't a better time for making things and put them on the internet. Like we can't do live action in the same level that we could before. So in some ways, the playing field is being equal in this respect, being leveled out in some respects in terms of entertainment, and we're all competing for time, right? Like that is the commodity. Where are you going to spend your time in terms of viewership? And I love what you said about the ecosystem, right? Like Ava DuVernay was a movie publicist for a very long time before she started directing. And so it is important to really understand where everything is coming from.
Yeah, just back onto that because it's a good point. Sometimes I talk to people who are creative and their eyes glaze over when you talk about that because they just want to sit in their corner and make their art, and because it's brilliant, the rest of the world's going to find it. And as realists, we know it's not that simple, but I would say that it is important for people to know what their boundaries are. So if you are that person, you should also know who to welcome into your fold, whether it's a producer or somebody to that effect, whose opinion you trust, who's willing to do that heavy lifting, because that practical stuff can't be ignored.
Absolutely. And it is always a collaboration, right? Like it's this business, and you talked about everything being full circle. And I also love that you brought up Trolls World Tour, like upending everything in terms of theatrical release. Couple more questions for you. What skills what do you think are the most important skills? You talked about like networking, all these different things, like in terms of like a tactical approach right now in this pandemic for someone who is just getting started in terms of criticism, other than the research aspects that you've mentioned, are there things that they can do, or like, is there a plan that you would put together if you were a graduate today?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question because I probably didn't talk as much about criticism as in some contexts I might, because there are so many other issues being discussed today. But it's something that is very near and dear to me, because I think that criticism is perhaps one of the most vital aspects of our culture, and that it is, less compromised. It's a way for us to process our world in an open and honest way. And it has a real currency in the industry too. In fact, for about 7 or 8 years, I ran an initiative called the Critics Academy at festivals in Switzerland and New York for aspiring film critics from around the world. And we were really emphasizing diversity in terms of not just ethnicity, but also in terms of different film cultures, people from around the world experiencing the limitations of their market and how to respond to that as a critic when your audience is global. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, that it's no longer the situation where you are restricted to your immediate surroundings and that's what you have to process. You can really live anywhere and have an opinion about the art that's being put out into the world, and people want to publish it. So I would say that if you are getting your start as a critic, or you're interested in processing the world from a critical standpoint, just start doing it, because you're not going to have a track record until you take that first step. Usually what I tell my own students is, if you're not writing for the college newspaper, start. If you've already graduated and you don't have that, I would say look for immediate opportunities anywhere, because the most immediate thing you're going to need, the most pressing thing you're going to need, is some example that you can put a sentence together. So having clips, being able to reach out to people and say, hey, I'm capable of writing substantially about film or TV or music or whatever it is, by showing them examples makes a big difference, even if it's for, you know, your friend's blog or whatever it is. You have to start somewhere. And having those deadlines gives you something to work towards. I don't think I could work without deadlines. In fact, I feel like I thrive on them, and I learned how to be a writer because of them. So creating those deadlines for yourself is a really important first step. And then paying attention to what's out there. I get a lot of people who write me and say, you know, my dream is to write about movies. I want to write about movies for you. And, you know, we're not hiring people to be critics right now, because we have a lot of talented writers who do that on our staff. But we are interested in original angles that deal with the ever-changing nature of this medium and can wrestle with both the art and the commerce side of the equation. So over the weekend, we had a great piece by a Mexican-born writer named Carlos Aguilar about the threat that's being made to diminish the financing for Mexican cinema, and the way that the three amigos kind of stepped up to take a stand and defend it in a very interesting kind of way. This was a story that was relatively foreign to us, because it's not an area that we're tracking. I mean, Latin American cinema is very interesting to me, but I'm not enmeshed in that world, nor am I fluent in that language. So for a writer to step up and say, one, I have a skill set that allows me to do this, but two, I understand why this story is important to you, makes a big difference. And so you really have to think in those terms and look at how publications are processing the world as they stand, so that you're not being redundant when you reach out to them and say, hey, I want to do this thing, when it turns out they're already doing it.
I love that. I think that's really amazing. I did see that article. I think it ties back to your point about, you know, figure out what your own story is and what you're bringing to it. Could you speak really quick? I have two questions with what you just said. You know, in terms of, other than IndieWire, CriticWire, and the Critics Academy that you were running, are there specific platforms that you think, or resources that you think, are essential for people? You mentioned writing for a friend's blog. Are there things that you think are more important or better in terms of launching a career in analysis and criticism, like podcasts versus Twitter versus Instagram or YouTube? Like, do you have any thought? What's your perspective?
Yeah, I'll tell you what's least valuable in all the things you just mentioned is Twitter, in the sense that I think social media is not something that can replace the sort of substance that you can produce when you're working for a publication that can validate your opinion. So it is important to have some kind of social presence. I do think, especially when you're getting started, to be able to manage that in a very careful sort of way so that the world can discover you is certainly important. I would not say that it should replace, say, the opportunity to write for a publication for 600 words or 800 words or whatever it is, because on some level, social media belongs to somebody else, but your ideas belong to you. And if you put your best ideas in this place that belong to somebody else, you're essentially giving your ideas away for free. In fact, I have this issue with our writers all the time where, and they know this well, where I'll see a tweet out there that's, you know, a very succinct reaction to something that's going on in the world. And I'll say, you know what, that's a great story. I'd love to see a couple more paragraphs in my inbox tomorrow morning explaining that. So I think it is really important to think about, you know, just how valuable your ideas are and how you choose to put them out there. And, you know, really strong writing does have a life. And nobody gets there overnight. You have to pay attention to what other people are doing in order to fully understand what that looks like. So read as much as you can. Like I said, I mean, pay attention to how the industry is changing. Read the trades, Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, read us, read, you know, Cineast and these and Reverse Shot, publications that are covering, you know, the aesthetics of film in a really interesting way to sort of deepen the way that you react to the medium. And don't just go for the obvious stories. You know, we know that Trolls World Tour is coming out and that it's a big deal because it's everywhere. But if you just want to write about Trolls World Tour, you're missing out on a huge, huge piece of the equation in terms of what else is out there. And being able to advocate for the smaller stuff, the weirder stuff, the riskier stuff, I think there's a lot more value to be found there.
I love that. I think that's really critical. How do you, well, you don't, let's see, you already talked about sort of the rise of virtual cinema and transactional VOD and electronic sell-through. How about, you talked a little bit about like other kinds of media. And so how has the rise of like streaming services, sort of this peak TV era, you mentioned you're obsessed, you know, you've got your Oculus and you're figuring out like these new mediums, you know, the prevalence of creator or influencer content. Do you feel like that makes more opportunities for criticism, or do you think it distracts and makes fewer? It kind of touches on your Twitter comment.
Well, you know, one of the things that I learned when we started covering television a decade ago is that there's no one person who can possibly watch every show that's out there. Being a film critic, at least in that very specific category at the start of my career, I was sort of spoiled by the idea that, you know, if you go to a handful of festivals and you pay attention to the release calendar, you kind of know everything that's out there. The sort of content game has accelerated in such a, you know, sort of overwhelming way that people who are paying attention to very specific shows that might be resonating for a very specific audience, I think have a real valuable kind of perspective to bring to the table. So in that sense, I think the kind of influx of new streaming entities has created the need for more people to pay attention to them. I also think that, you know, it's less a streaming war than it is sort of a content war. And there is this real sense that some of these new entities are going to last longer than others because they aren't necessarily investing in quality programming, and, you know, nobody can afford all of them right now, or, you know, a very small piece of the population can in any case, and people's patience wear thin. So and as a result, I don't think that people are going to just invest in all these streaming platforms and then just use them all at once. They're going to find where they're most comfortable, and as a result, we're going to see, I think, a kind of a landscape that is very much responsive to the need for quality storytelling, and critics are the people who tell us that storytelling is worthwhile.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one last question and then we're going to wrap everything up. Do you have any insights into, you know, from what you're seeing and hearing in terms of the pandemic, how this will influence international artists and the influx of foreign cinema? You know, we saw the, you know, I was super pumped when Parasite won the Academy Award. How do you think the pandemic is, and the impact of globalization and all these sort of complicated factors, like what is your take and where do you think this is going to take us?
It's a great question, because if you'd asked me that at the start of this year, I would say that, you know, we're clearly entering a golden age for quote unquote foreign language film, or at least a better understanding of why that is such a limiting term, and the ability for a film like Parasite to go from, you know, the first Korean film to win Palme d'Or to the first, you know, non-English language film to win Best Picture and break all these box office records was really mind-blowing, and felt like it was also on a continuum following, you know, what Roma had done in terms of raising awareness about this issue that we tend to focus too much on national cinema and are afraid of subtitles and all that kind of stuff. And everyone was thinking that, you know, the market at Cannes was going to be crazy this year because Parasite launched there. So all these people with deep pockets were going to go and buy non-English language films. Right now, I don't know if that's the case, but I do know that when we see this Cannes lineup on Wednesday, you're going to see that there are a lot of great new movies from filmmakers around the world, and the companies that would be buying those movies at Cannes still exist. So those films are going to have a life, and it's going to be an interesting question to see exactly what that life looks like. It might not be, you know, making millions of dollars in theaters, but it is going to be a very active film culture that I think has a much wider sense of possibility than ever before. So it's a very interesting time, and I'm super curious to see the way just the rest of this year is going to go in terms of how some of these films come to the market. And again, I just encourage people to follow that news. Don't wait for the films to come out. Read about them when we find out about them, and keep tabs on them, because when somebody acquires something, that itself tells you something about the sort of the state of the art form around the world.
Thank you so much, Eric. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today and for your great insights and perspective.
Happy to be here. Thanks again.
Thank you. All right. Well, that sort of wraps up our show. I want to thank Eric, thank all of our amazing presenters for sharing their insights and their perspectives with us. Thank you again to NYU LA, the Wasserman Center for Career Development, the Tisch Office for Career Development, and the NYU Production Lab. I'm not going to say everyone's name because there are too many people to thank, but thank you so much for making this event possible. And thanks to all of you for coming out to spend time with us and for your really great questions. Just again, a reminder that there is a resource document with a link to the video of this event, as well as the key takeaways that all the presenters have given and additional resources, and that will be available to everyone after this event, probably in an email later this week. So thanks to all of you for attending, and I hope you all stay safe and healthy during this time.